Good morning. I'm T.Y. Chang from TYTI Investigates. And today we're going to be talking about, let me just adjust this a little bit here, a little bit down. And okay, well, it's a little crooked. Sorry about that. Okay. So good morning. I'm T.Y. Chang from TYTI Investigates. Today, I labeled the discussion today George Floyd and climate change. And I'm trying to talk about the connection between the environmental or climate activists and the anti-racism, anti-police brutality, hashtag Black Lives Matter movement, mass movement that is almost as quickly as the pandemic changed America is changing America as well, this time for a good cause. And I will want to talk about that in the relationship between climate activism and anti-racism. And then also, if I have some time later, talk about violence in this movement and some of the anti-Asian attitude that's come up, and why I think a peaceful, united front will actually, in the long term, do more. And I connect it eventually to what happens for Bernie Sanders and whether they should support Joe Biden or not. So let me get back to, so on the, if you've been following the news at all, and I'm sure you have, since you're the Young Turks audience, you're very up to date on things, I'm sure. And then one of the things is about the climate activists are noting that for a long time, the climate activism was something that was primarily a white movement, and that they realized that this was a mistake because clearly there has been a huge portion of the climate crisis connected to racism. And that's come out, especially in the pandemic. One thing that was noted was that the people who live in communities of color tend to live near in poorer areas and that are closer to more polluting industries. In other words, things like oil refineries, trash recycling areas, trash waypoints, and things like that. And that because of that, and also industrial factories, and because of that, the lungs of these people in these communities are weaker and have more diseases. And they found that when your lungs are compromised that way by years of pollution, they tend to have more asthma, tend to have more sicknesses related to the lungs. And when you're exposed to the COVID-19 virus, it's more deadly. In fact, in Chicago, some of the death rates for African Americans were double what it was for the rest of the population. And so that's something that climate activists have found that during the pandemic, this connection between the air quality in poorer communities and especially communities of color, and also the death rate from the coronavirus. But it actually had started before that. If you remember, Flint, Michigan had all this lead in its water. Now, Flint is primarily an African American community. And what they found was that a couple of supervisors who knew about the lead levels in Flint ignored it, and also ignored complaints by people in the community. And it went pretty high up. I don't know exactly how high. I'm assuming pretty much everybody who was in control of Flint knew about this. And then what happened was that it was finally exposed that there was lead in the water. And to this day, it's not been fully repaired. It's a massive task to repair the entire water system. And it would take a commitment to people, especially to the African American community of Flint. And that has not yet happened. There have been some moves after it was exposed at how high the lead levels were. But this again was an instance of where climate activism was connected to anti-racism in the sense that communities of color are exposed more to these pollutants and to more of the problems, the severity of some of the climate crisis already, and in terms of pandemics as well. So a number of organizations have now, a number of climate organizations have said that this is an inflection point, that this is a big change, that it's they are finally prioritizing social justice and racial equality, or racial equity even. It's not simply enough to list diversity as one of our values, according to one activist. Like climate change, there is no simple fix for racism, but we will not shy away from doing our part in this vital work. So what's happening now is a connection between social justice and racial equality with the climate change, climate crisis, global warming, and climate activism. That now the realization that you cannot have climate activism, and which is about justice for people and ultimately to help people, without also addressing racism and police brutality. So this was something that a number of organizations, major organizations in the climate activism movement, have endorsed and adopted. I mean, some of the organizations listed are the NDRC, National Defense Resource Council, Greenpeace, 350.org, Sierra Club, Rising, Sunrise Movement. All these organizations, big green organizations, are getting involved. A co-chair of the National Climate Justice Alliance says he is hopeful and as well as skeptical. Given what she considers a historically extractive use of climate justice narrative by big green organizations, she said these groups must take direction from Black Lives Matter organizers in protesting George Floyd's killing, that brutal, totally, clearly unnecessary killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And by the way, they have the Minneapolis City Council is now, the majority in a veto-proof vote has decided to defund the Minneapolis Police Department. What that means is not getting rid of all, police in the sense, but basically getting rid of the Minneapolis Police Department and reforming a new and coming up with a new policing organization that is going to be more not just receptive, but stop brutalizing the African American community in Minneapolis. And they note that for many years they tried to reform the Minneapolis Police Department, but because of the entrenchment of a number, well, I guess the majority of officers in the Minneapolis Police Department, they've decided it's impossible to reform it. They have to get rid of it and bring in a completely new organization. So defund does not mean not having any police at all. It just means any police organization that refuses to change, that refuses to stop brutalizing, in particular the African American community, and also I guess all communities of color, because I know in New York City there have been police brutality issues against all communities of color, African American, Latino, Asian, and so that's something where that has to be, when you defund a police organization, it's not about getting rid of all police, it's about taking organizations that refuse to change and then replacing them with a new organization. So I'll give you another example, read to you from something. Alexandria Villasenor, the 15-year-old climate activist who is co-founder of the U.S. Youth Climate Strike and founder of Earth Uprising, emphatically agrees. I think that true solidarity is giving Black Lives Matter organizers platforms, donations, and putting our bodies out there on the streets with them. And she said, we know there's no climate justice without racial justice. The exploitation of Black people is the greatest extractive system of production of all time. And in order to heal the planet, we must have Black and Indigenous liberation. So that's also a point that we talk about with climate activism now, is the impact on the climate crisis, global warming on Indigenous people. For example, the native Indigenous peoples in the Amazon forest are the most impacted by the destruction of the Amazon forest. It's the destruction of their homes. And not only is President Bolsonaro of Brazil, not only is he supporting the loggers and the people who are chopping down the Amazon forest, which affects all the world, but it especially affects the people who live in the forest, the indigenous peoples there, and they are in fact not only destroying their homes, they're those who stand up against it, they have killed and attacked physically. So that's talking about racial justice and climate justice. And when you think about it, one climate organizer said to me that when we were talking about the pandemic, why he supported the pandemic stimulus without any green stimulus. He said, because being a climate activist is about helping people. And if we're going to help people, we have to deal with the pandemic immediately first because people are dying. So in this sense, too, it's the same thing that so many climate activists really come from a place of love. They want to help the planet and help people on the planet and the species, and a different species. And then if you care about people and justice, in that sense, you're going to care about racial justice as well. That's the argument that I think many of the climate organizers are awakening to, as the whole country did. And when I was in New York City last week, and I saw the massive demonstrations, one thing that gave me great hope in seeing was that in these demonstrations, there were a lot of young people, which is good, but they were also extremely diverse. And I don't mean just like a smattering, but I saw a lot of Black people, I saw a lot of Latinos, I saw a lot of white people, saw a lot of Asians. And that gave me great hope to see so many people, also different ages, but mainly young people. But in terms of race, every single race was really amply represented. Now, it may not be true in every city, but New York City is probably the most diverse city in the United States. And I know in one borough of New York City, Queens, it's considered the most diverse entity or area of government in the entire world. They have all 160 plus countries of the entire world represented in Queens. So in these demonstrations, you could see that something hopeful, that you saw a lot of people, young, but every race, and in many, many large numbers. I mean, Black, white, Latino, and Asian. I mean, it wasn't just a smattering. It's important that every group, every race was represented, because how awful the killing of, and unwarranted, the killing of George Floyd clearly was. I mean, I covered crime for many, many years, and every police officer I've ever talked to says that once you handcuff somebody, the threat is over. The worst thing that can happen is they run away with handcuffs, with their hands handcuffed behind them, and that's not a problem. That is not a danger to anybody. A person handcuffed from behind is, incapacitated. They can't really do anything. And then to have your foot on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds as he's begging for his life is just awful. And then, so I think this woke up the entire country and entire world. I mean, there have been mass demonstrations in London, in Amsterdam, in Berlin, in Australia, New Zealand, in Seoul, South Korea, in Hong Kong. I know there have been a lot of demonstrations all over the world supporting George Floyd, supporting hashtag Black Lives Matter, opposing police brutality. So getting back to so Inside Climate News describes how environmental groups have long struggled with diversity in their ranks and have reached an inflection point and are finally prioritizing, as I mentioned, social justice and racial equity. And the GRIST reports of a new study showing that indigenous climate activists around the world face an outside risk of criminalization, violence, and even death as a consequence of their activism and work. Quote, "We mean to think of this as compounded injustice, highlighting the extreme risk vulnerable communities opposing social and environmental violence against them face when they stand up for their rights." So this is that the climate activists have already begun to recognize the rights of indigenous peoples and the dangers they face, the increased dangers both from pollution and from attacks from basically industries. That the one researcher is also from GRIST. I don't know if this is true, but it says that TV news ignores the devastating and disproportionate impact of hurricanes on communities of color and how parts of the Green Movement are coming to grip with their racist past. This is a quote from This is coming from Grist. The Rising had two op-eds that break down the climate and social justice connection in clear terms. Quote, when it comes to environmental justice, we aren't just talking about uh, talking about social equity. When it comes to environmental justice, we just aren't talking about social equity enough, writes Emily Dow. And she goes on to say, from unleashing toxic pollutants in neighborhoods populated by people of color to building oil pipelines in indigenous lands, environmental racism has a long and disturbing history, writes Ari Kelo in The Other, detailing how COVID-19 has laid bare the environmental injustices in this country. And we've seen that in that, as again, I mentioned that when communities of color and excuse me, and poor communities in general tend to live in the air, they tend to live closer to the polluting sources, the industries, the garbage dumps, the dirtier, even next to the highways, close to the highways. And so their lungs are worse, asthma is worse. And then because of that, the COVID-19 virus has more impact on their lungs and kills people more. The death rate is higher. And when polluting oil and gas wells are drilled near residences, it is often in communities of color. This is from the Guardian newspaper. It reports on a new study showing how this affects health outcomes beginning at birth. Based on records of 3 million births in California, the study found that pregnant women living close to active wells were much more likely to have babies with low birth weights and a higher risk of developmental issues. I know that I did a study I guess not that long, 15 years ago. And I found out in New York City, you have 5 boroughs, 4 of which are located on an island. And Staten Island has a bridge bringing it to New York City, the only bridge bringing it to New York City, which is the Verrazano Bridge. And for a long time, this is before Easy Pass technology, there would be long lines of cars in Staten Island to pay the toll to go into Brooklyn, and from Brooklyn to go into wherever to Manhattan. And what happened was that 1 o'clock in the morning in 1996, excuse me, I believe it was 1996, Republican Senator Alphonse D'Amato and Republican Congressman Guy Molinaro put into a budget bill at 1 o'clock in the morning that the Verrazano Bridge would only be a one-way toll, and it would be double. So that if you were leaving Brooklyn to go into Staten Island, it would be double. But if you're leaving Staten Island to go into Brooklyn, it would be free. It became a federal act, and it will take an act of Congress to change it. And so far, Chuck Schumer, who initially opposed it, now still supports it. So, and with the Easy Pass technology, it really is no longer a need. There are no more long lines causing more pollution in Staten Island because people are zipping through the Easy Pass. So one of the things that happened, though, was that truckers who used to go from Brooklyn through Staten Island into New Jersey to the mainland of the United States, would no longer go through Verrazano Bridge because it's double the toll. And this is not for a trucker. A toll could be as much as $80 to $100, depending on how big their truck is. And so even with Easy Pass, the lowest rates were something $60 to $70. I think now it's still up to $80. So the truckers and a lot of traffic that was planning to go to the mainland through Staten Island, going west, would then instead go through Brooklyn into Manhattan, and they would take the free bridges from Brooklyn to Manhattan, which are the Manhattan and the Brooklyn bridges, mainly the Manhattan Bridge, because trucks are not allowed on the Brooklyn Bridge. The Manhattan Bridge goes through Chinatown. So over the years, once this happened in the 1990s, and I did the story, I think about 15 years ago, the asthma rate in Chinatown quadrupled, 4 times higher, and it was already high because there's a lot of traffic on Canal Street that comes off the Manhattan Bridge into Canal Street. But after this change, all the heavy traffic quadrupled the asthma rate. And the asthma rate in Chinatown is quadruple the rest of New York City. And that's an indication or one example of how politics can affect, the climate crisis and affect pollution in communities of color. And it's not just about money, because what happened is that Canal Street runs past not only Chinatown, but it runs past Soho, which is the name for south of Houston. And that's an experience extremely, it used to be an industrial area, but over the years it developed in this very fancy area with a lot of fancy stores, which got looted during some of the bad parts of the protest, or at the nighttime. And it's not clear if it was actually looted by protesters. Apparently, there have been reports how many professional thieves had driven in with out-of-state plates, rental cars, and had organized groups breaking in and actually loading cars and taking off. But they have the plate numbers, so hopefully they'll track them down. But in any case, so Soho, an extremely wealthy neighborhood, also experiences